Okay, so Ireland's Magdalene institutions stretch back to 1767, and James M. Smith describes that although these institutions were founded with a philanthropic mission, they became by the close of the 19th century more pastoral than rehabilitative in nature. So that's just the picture of the last one there. Um, By the time Ireland achieved independence in the early 1920s, the then Catholic-run asylums were already in place to perform their part in the purity project of nation building. Their work was to contain the perilous bodies of those considered to be the most disrespectful, economically vulnerable girls and women. When committed to Magdalene asylums, Irish women were regulated into a system of hard labour and prayer. Though often physically abused, the aim of their punishment was mainly internal. They were forced to internalise what was deemed their guilt and shame in order to rationalise their own incarceration. Magdalene women's imprisonment also served as a tool to keep free women within the confines of their homes, under the control of their husbands or fathers, and deter them from challenging the Catholic patriarchal system. In an Irish context of post-independence, this concern was overtly centred on women and on their perceived social roles, responsibilities, duties, and status. In terms of study, why did I choose to focus on the Magdalene Laundries as a case study? I chose this as my focus because the laundries were a clear example of gendered incarceration in an Irish context. And I wanted to reflect on how the institutional mechanism of genre, of cinematic genre, which itself is gendered and limiting, frames this incarceration. Contemporary Ireland is still haunted by the legacy of the Magdalene Laundries, primarily because the Irish institutions of state and church seek to bury this history in the present and thereby render survivors' truth unknown. In his work, Nicholas Mertzoff discusses the ways in which governments or those in power deliberately authorize and legitimize certain visions, certain versions of the past towards the creation of what he calls visuality. Mertzoff asserts that visuality is that which renders the processes of history visible to power. Therefore, it is reasonable to understand why those in a position of authority will only ever present history in a way that does not challenge their own power. Presentation of history that has the ability to challenge the power of authority is what Mertzoff calls countervisuality. Countervisuality is about claiming the right to look or seeking alternative truths than the ones sanctioned by the powerful. Countervisuality also means requiring the recognition of the other in order to have a place from which to claim rights and determine what is right. Magdalene survivors seek this recognition from the Irish state in relation to the abuses perpetrated against them, and so that they might be able to assert their right to redress, existence, and acceptance. As Mertzoff clarifies, the autonomy claimed by the right to look is thus opposed by the authority of visuality. Claire McGettrick et al. Inform us that church and state are steadfast in remaining intentionally ignorant of their role in the Magdalene abuses and their responsibility in providing adequate redress for survivors. This prevents survivors from gaining the justice and healing they need. Fintan O'Toole reminds us that there is often much more power in being forced to confront what you already know than in being amazed by the unexpected. This describes the power of the countervisual. The countervisual is not something that is completely unknown. It is something we are encouraged to ignore or look away from. Mertzoff compares this concept to the situation in which you walk by a crime scene and a police officer tells you to move on as there's nothing to see when you know that there is. One of the key spaces at our disposal to support the act of public truth-telling and create countervisual outlooks is cinema. There have been 7 fictional feature films concerning the Irish Magdalene Laundries, released between 2002 and 2026. I will look at 4 of these films today. As I move from the first films to the later ones, the potential for countervisuality increases as I start off by looking at the restrictive genre of melodrama, move on to the more experimental genre of found footage horror, and finally finished with the self-reflexivity of art cinema. I will first look at two films from 2002, The Magdalene Sisters and Sinners. Both films are set in the 1960s, a period during which the Laundries were a thriving force in Ireland. Both are examples of melodrama, or at least contain many melodramatic elements that give each film a very definite structure and impose restrictions. In terms of representing Ireland's Magdalene Laundries on screen, it is important to consider whether the genre of melodrama or the use of melodramatic conventions can be successful in furthering the discourse around these issues and helping the nation to deal with its traumatic past in a way that is healing for survivors and avoids reoccurrence of these abuses. I later discussed The Devil's Doorway and Cellar Door as examples of horror and art film. I will consider whether the genres of horror and art film are capable of presenting the audience with countervisual perspective on the Magdalene Laundries. The first melodrama I will examine is The Magdalene Sisters from 2002, directed by Peter Mullen. It concerns three young women called Margaret, Bernadette, and Rose as they enter into a Magdalene laundry against their will. The film depicts their horrific experiences there. Elizabeth Cullingford notes that Mullen's fact-based film participates in a long-established fictional genre constituted by melodramatic exaggeration, the sexualized anti-Catholic Gothic. According to Cullingford, in Mullen's film, female religious life has no justification other than profit, power, or perversion. In one particularly shocking scene, Sister Jude and Sister Clementine humiliate a group of naked women, comparing their breast size and genital hair. Melodramatic exaggeration, such as the kind this scene conveys, pushes this film into the territory of the Gothic. Within this space, it is very difficult to portray any kind of countervisual perspective that indicates state and social responsibility for the existence of these institutions. Another example of melodramatic exaggeration that pushes the film into the realms of the Gothic happens after Bernadette has attempted to escape for the first time. She's pinned down by Sister Jude and Sister Clementine, while Sister Bridget brutally cuts her hair as blood streams down her face. Cullingford calls this a striking moment of visual Gothic and reasons that Mullen's aesthetics and anger lead him into melodramatic exaggeration. Exaggeration, however, diminishes much of the complexity around the existence of the laundries. Christine Gledhill recognizes that derision of melodrama frequently stems from an attachment to an outmoded past, to what seems simplistic Victorian personifications of good and evil, innocence and villainy. Good and evil are depicted in very simplistic terms within this film. One scene in The Magdalene Sisters that does have countervisual potential is when the nuns organize a film viewing on Christmas Day. Through the framed screening of The Bells of St. Mary's, we are shown the idealization of Catholicism side by side with the grim reality. James M. Smith affirms that Mullen's juxtaposition of the two Reverend Mothers exposes the seductive sentimentality that works through popular media to buttress the nuns' absolute power. The framed watching of the classic Hollywood film presents us with church-sanctioned visuality that is simultaneously being deconstructed through the eyes of the Magdalene women. This active countervisual watching is privileged in this scene and demonstrates the disillusionment the Magdalene women feel with the establishment. The use of a Hollywood melodrama in this scene that idealizes the church and the convent also acts as a critique of the genre of melodrama itself. The melodramatic film moves Sister Bridget to tears when the real-life suffering of the women under her care leaves her cold. This communicates the superficiality of feelings stirred up by melodrama. So Sinners then is a melodrama directed by Aisling Walsh in 2002 also. Plot centers on the experience of Anne-Marie, who has been incarcerated in a Magdalene laundry for becoming pregnant outside of wedlock. Laura Mulvey describes that melodramatic characters act out of contradiction, achieving actual confrontation to varying degrees and gradually facing impossible resolutions and probable defeats. In Sinners, the character of Kitty hopes that she can convince Patrick to marry her so that she can keep her daughter and free herself from the laundry. She also hopes that he will let Anne-Marie come and stay with them as well. This is hopelessly naive, especially as Patrick presents as a fickle character whose mother and sister rely on him for income. It is also out of character for Kitty, who has been a source of reason and wisdom for Anne-Marie up to this point. Linda Williams believes that the melodramatic solution to the real issues raised by the form can only occur through a perverse process of victimization. When Patrick informs the nuns of his and Kitty's affair, she is beaten and her daughter is taken from her. Shortly after, she commits suicide, which is the culmination of a series of intense moments of victimization. In relation to Kitty's story, we can see that the formal mechanisms of melodrama largely guide her actions and limit her behavior. Mary Ann Dewan admits that the woman's film is not at all radical or revolutionary. It functions quite precisely to immobilize. Female characters remain stuck and in rhythms of repeated behavior that bring about no new results. In order for countervisuality to occur, melodrama or the woman's film needs to be radical and revolutionary. Witnessing innocent women being abused physically and verbally forces us as an audience to feel sympathy for them, but it does not necessarily make us aware of the social and political reasons for this abuse. And Thomas Alsasser claims that it has encouraged increasingly escapist forms of mass entertainment. Escapist forms of cinema cannot conjure up countervisual perspectives that challenge power structures and state-endorsed ideologies. Williams informs us that one of the key features of melodrama is its compulsion to reconcile the irreconcilable. That is, its tendency to find solutions to problems that cannot really be solved without challenging the older ideologies of moral certainty to which melodrama wishes to return. A sham marriage to a virtual stranger is the only solution to Anne-Marie's internment. An Irish woman can only be respectable within the confines of marriage, the reasons for which melodrama does not wish to challenge. Gledhill acknowledges that melodrama addresses us within the limitations of the status quo, of the ideologically permissible. Anne-Marie's liberation does not liberate the other Magdalene women or end the system of female incarceration and control. If melodrama is only able to find solutions within an existing power structure and without challenging the authority of that power structure, it cannot be countervisual. One scene that does have countervisual potential in Sinners is an early scene in which the women, under the surveillance of a nun, are sewing and knitting reflectively in the evening room. One woman cries at the window as she watches her child being taken away by their new parents against her will. On the radio, a commentator describes events as President Eamon de Valera is being blessed in a special mass. The coupling of a mother's anguish at being separated from her baby and the Catholic blessing of Eamon de Valera is very significant in this scene. In the diegetic pairing of sounds, Walsh implicates de Valera in this woman's suffering. Cullingford reminds us that it was de Valera's 1937 constitution which accorded the Catholic Church a special position within the Irish state, enshrined the heterosexual family as the national norm, and defined women solely as mothers within the home. Irish women who were seen as to transgress patriarchal and Catholic conservative norms were deemed the highest threat, and a lot of power was bestowed on the Catholic Church by the state to ensure social order remained intact. A key part of this scene is when Breda changes the station and therefore interrupts de Valera's blessing in favor of the pop song Walking Back to Happiness. This is where the countervisual potential of the scene comes to the fore. Switching the station in this way is a rejection of Eamon de Valera by these women and all he stands for. It is a rejection of the poisonous, corrupt relationship between Irish church and state, and a rejection of church and state authorised visualities. Walsh boldly implicates the state in the Magdalene Laundries and mother and baby institutions and directly names Eamon de Valera as a key conspirator. This is a much stronger indictment of the state than Mullen manages to achieve in the Magdalene Sisters. In both films, however, time and time again, the institution of melodrama undercuts, reinforces, and waters down the intended message of both directors, and simultaneously the potential for countervisuality. Sarah Kozlov identifies that melodrama as a genre that deals with social problems can either be labeled as conservative or liberal. The reason for this is that often a liberal director's aim is to shine a light on a certain social inequality. Yet the formal fundamentals of melodrama are traditionally very restrictive and impose certain limitations on the material, potentially making the resulting product quite conservative. Kozlov questions whether an audience's empathy with minority characters and their woes is condescending or socially progressive, and she asks whether melodramas indoctrinate viewers in traditional conservative social values or awaken their anger and resistance. Though it cannot be denied that melodrama has allowed women a valuable space in cinema, and often critical reaction to melodrama stems from inherent sexism, it is still a highly limiting genre that often becomes contradictory in its aims. Mainstream melodrama is a repressive institution in itself, and so when melodrama as a genre is employed with all the best intentions to portray narratives within institutional settings, such as the Magdalene Laundries, it tends to reinforce the oppression of these places through form. So next, I will examine the genre of horror as it seeks to represent the Magdalene Laundries on screen. I will evaluate the countervisual success of The Devil's Doorway and its ability to challenge state and church-sanctioned visualities on Magdalene Laundries. Directed by Aislinn Clark, The Devil's Doorway follows Father John Thornton and Father Thomas Riley as they are sent to investigate the blood weeping of a statue within a Magdalene Laundry in 1960. I don't think that trailer is going to work. Well, it might actually, since it's there. Does it? Oh yeah, okay. Okay, we'll go past that. The act of looking is central to The Devil's Doorway. The diegetic camera is strongly affiliated with the person who holds it, creating a stronger point of view perspective than that featured in cinema using standard non-diegetic cameras. Adam Charles Hart points out that found footage horror puts the look on display, the bearer of the look mostly off screen, and that this focuses the spectator's attention on the act of looking. This framed looking makes the viewer conscious of the act of looking and how central it is to the cinematic viewing process. The body of the looker remains on screen, so the look remains central rather than the character, who usually occupies the frame. This alerts the audience to the ways in which our gaze is directed in cinema. The look is fundamental to Mertzhoff's theories of visuality and countervisuality. Making the look explicit is a key tool in the establishment of the countervisual. This allows the viewer to recognize that our gaze is very deliberately directed by cinema, just as it is outside of cinema. Hart argues that the danger is embodied in the figure of the camera person, whose searching look indicates a fundamental vulnerability. I would argue that the look itself is vulnerable in found footage cinema, and that something is actively working against this right to look. Within the found footage horror film, this is the fear established by the diegesis. The fear represents the force working against the right to look or countervisuality. The pressure to look the other way is visuality. This makes found footage horror a viable vehicle for, or at least a representation of, countervisuality. The countervisual is the vulnerable look. It is the chaos that impinges on the endorsed normal and civilized. The camera is set up as a character with its own identity as it films watches itself in the mirror, which Kjetil argues is a feature of found footage horror. Roger points out that the role of the camera as surviving witness is among the most characteristic traits of found footage horror. In The Devil's Doorway, the camera is the last surviving witness. Our two protagonists are attacked and killed in the very last scenes of the film. The camera, as last surviving witness, conveys a perspective independent of human control. The last shot of the film is a candelabra from a sideways angle. The camera has fallen on its side, which is an example of a decentered mode of framing that Cecilia Syed argues defies the rules of composition, dictating that the looker's attention ought to be guided by a certain positioning of the elements in the frame. the amount of space they occupy, their color, movement, or quality. This is not the only instance of the camera filming independently of human control within the film. The second night that John is woken by the sound of ghosts, the haunting activity culminates in John running to wake Thomas, who has slept through the whole event. Before running to wake Thomas, John drops the camera to the floor, and as we hear him talking to Thomas, a pair of ghostly legs walk into and out of shot silently. And that's that third picture there. Another key incident where the camera films independently of human control is when Kathleen goes into labor and the priests run to fetch the doctor. John leaves the camera filming close up on Kathleen's face, where it remains for the rest of the birth scene. The fact that the camera acts as an independent witness to the events of the laundry more than once bolsters the notion that the camera is set up as a character in its own right. The identification of the camera as a character is a personification of the gaze itself, alerting the audience even more to the act of watching as an active and living process rather than a passive one. This allows for the countervisual potential of this subcategory of horror. The fact that the audience's gaze is directed in unconventional and unsanctioned directions, all the while drawing the audience's own awareness towards this process, speaks towards countervisuality. Institutional cinema often has the effect of overly containing material related to the Magdalene Laundries. By this, I mean that the narrative obeys very strict and impermeable generic structures in a way that gives the audience a sense that the events of the laundries are a thing of the past and that they have been thoroughly dealt with. In Melodrama, for example, when dealing with the laundries, the audience goes through the motions of female suffering and victimization towards a happy ending that does not challenge the wider political and social structures responsible for the laundries. The audience is left with a sense of closure and that the laundries are a thing of the past to be forgotten about. This is not an accurate representation of trauma continuously endured by survivors of the laundries, and in fact aligns with the state and church sanctioned discourse around the laundries to date. Syed states that the frame in horror invites considerations about both the harboring of monsters off screen and the dangers lurking in the dark corners of a delimited visual field. The dangers of a delimited visual field is another way of defining Murtzow's visuality. Visuality is never the full picture, but only what those in power legitimize as right and true. It is important to explore the framed image both as the locus for the appearance of evil forces that would not otherwise be seen, and as a fragment of a larger reality that cannot be fully grasped. This delimited visual field has the potential to convey the trauma of the laundries as a national trauma that cannot fully be grasped by Ireland as a nation. Syed describes that the frame in both handheld and static shots is as incapable of containing what exists within its territory as it is of protecting it from the invasion of what lies beyond its borders. The breaking down of boundaries in found footage horror strives towards the de-institutionalization of cinema and genre, which is required in order to present a countervisual perspective. The priests in the film use the camera to investigate what might be the presence of God, but it soon becomes obvious that the presence within the laundry is far from godly or good. As in other found footage films, a key aim of filming within the narrative is to try and contain these supernatural events, which is never possible. This film demonstrates the impossibility of containing the evil that happened within the laundries and therefore challenges the power of visuality. In accordance with the conventions of horror, most haunting episodes within the Devil's Doorway take place at night. On the second night, we hear a young female voice recite a nursery rhyme. The nursery rhyme she recites is very significant. It is not unusual for nursery rhymes to feature in horror because something considered innocent and associated with children, when placed in the context of horror, can have an incredibly eerie effect. Nursery rhymes, however, are not innocent and often reference dark and taboo topics from the time of their conception. In this scene, the ghost girl recites a version of the nursery rhyme Goosey Goosey Gander. She recounts these particular verses. Old Father Longlegs can't say his prayers. Take him by the left leg and throw him down the stairs. Once he's at the bottom, crying out in pain, take him by the left leg and throw him up again. Within these lines, there is a very apparent stress on the connection between enforced religion and physical punishment. Variations of this British rhyme have existed since the 18th century, which is its earliest known publication. A lot of historians believe Old Father Longlegs is a Catholic priest hiding away in a priest hole, which was a place where rich families hid priests while under threat of persecution from figures such as Henry VIII or Oliver Cromwell. Left leg is slang for Catholic, and can't say his prayers refers to the refusal of Catholic priests to say Protestant prayers. As the ghost child begins to taunt Father John with these verses, the nursery rhyme becomes a threat against the young priest. We can hear John's panicked breathing as he tries to find the source of the voice. This is a useful space to explore countervisuality in relation to the laundries. The ghost girl recounts the nursery rhyme in an off-screen space in opposition to this young priest and everything he stands for, as he directs our gaze upon the on-screen space. The rhyme now becomes an off-screen call to throw off the shackles of the church by metaphorically throwing these patriarchal power structures down the stairs, which is also a call towards countervisuality. As John searches for her, the girl moves into an on-screen space due to what Stephen Prince labels a porous boundary between the two spaces. A porous boundary is particularly evident in found footage horror in order to convey the difficulty of capturing the elusive ghostly figures on camera. Sound from the off-screen space also seeps into the on-screen, and this creates communication between the seen and unseen, the visual and the countervisual. John sees the young girl sitting at the bottom of the stairs, reciting the rhyme, whilst playing with a puppet, signifying the manipulation and control of people by the church. As John approaches the bottom of the stairs, the girl has disappeared, and only the puppet remains. The appearance and disappearance of the ghost child between the on-screen and off-screen space strengthens the communication between the visual and counter-visual, which the breakdown in the boundary between the on-screen and off-screen space allows. Horror, particularly found footage horror like The Devil's Doorway, demonstrates a much greater capacity for countervisuality than more rigid genres such as melodrama that adhere much more closely to the codes and conventions of classic Hollywood cinema. The Devil's Doorway features a pronounced focus on the act of looking, the establishment of the camera as an independent witness, an inability to fully contain the narrative within the frame, porous boundaries, and the acknowledgement of an off-screen space. All of these characteristics provide space for countervisuality on screen and challenge the state and church-sanctioned national narrative surrounding the Magdalene Laundries. So then the final film I'll look at is Cellar Door. Cellar Door is an art film from 2018, directed by Vico Nietzsche. Through the protagonist, Adi, who suffers from dementia, Cellar Door opposes the state-endorsed and deliberate forgetting of the Magdalene Laundries. The film follows Adi from her point of view as she is caught in a cycle of events that keeps repeating, where she desperately tries to find her baby or son, who she knows has been taken from her. Cellar Door problematizes the notion of memory and witness testimony in situations of trauma, as well as contesting the Irish state's dealings with historical cases of institutional abuse. The film represents Adi's spontaneous confabulation of events around her. This medical term describes the fictitious stories that are produced in the minds of dementia patients because their ongoing reality and planning are dominated by their past experiences. In the film, a cycle of confabulations occurs 4 times approximately every 20 minutes. The events of each cycle are never fully the same, but the same locations are visited every time. The first cycle begins with Adi submerged in a bath wearing a red dress. The film cuts to a conversation between her and her mother. We then see Adi standing by a blackboard in front of a class of young children. The fourth scene takes place in a dance hall where couples are dancing to loud music and a young man called Carl embraces her, and the scene suddenly shifts to a church. Adie approaches the altar and she and Carl begin to embrace and undress each other. She then notices a nun watching them from the shadows and stops. Carl disappears from the frame and Adie is immediately presented as pregnant and in labor. After each cycle is over, Adie is shown in an institution under the close observation of a nun and a priest, Bly and Castle. The cycle varies each time, but each cycle begins with Adie either in the bath or in the bathroom. Mark Betts identifies that art film is a self-referential aesthetic production, a system of motifs, illusions, and devices that the director combines to create a complex world of signs. Time in modern European cinema is frequently held as the hallmark of its particular formal innovations in narration and storytelling. Unlike classical cinema, with its rather strict and elaborate set of rules that presuppose and reinforce a stable viewing position through a steady flow of differing views of time, space, and character, in accordance with conventions of linear causality, continuity, and narrative art cinema. A narrative art cinema works the extremes of the temporal spatial narrative continuum, testing the boundaries among foreground aesthetic construction, spectatorial engagement, and narrative intelligibility. Cellar Door is a countervisual film because it defies the codes and conventions of classic Hollywood cinema in order to depict the complicated experience of institutional cinema related to the Magdalene Laundries that has been largely ignored or neglected by the Irish state. Murtzoff notes that part of the process of undoing visualities is to also undo the process of undoing. Cellar Door undoes the persistent state-endorsed visualities around the laundries while laying bare its own cinematic mechanisms of doing so, undoing the structure of containment that cinema upholds and making the viewer aware of this process through active engagement with the film. Cellar Door denies the familiar experience of mainstream cinema that often reassures and comforts audiences. This perspective is countervisual as it challenges the state-sanctioned perspective that promotes the relegation of wrongful gendered institutionalization to the past, the undervaluation of this history and its effect on present-day Ireland, and the depreciation of the Magdalene Laundry experience. We are not offered a sense of closure with the cliche that time heals all wounds. Rather, time is presented as an uncontrollable force in this film. Adie's trauma is continuous, and she relives the experience of institutionalization as a single mother and being dispossessed of her child. Unlike the case of Melodrama that situates the trauma of the Magdalene Laundries in the past and consigns this trauma to the past, this film alerts us to the everyday reality of living with traumatic memories in the present. Through Adie's marked individual point of view, we are forced to think about the inescapable effect of the past on the present, particularly in relation to trauma. Through Adie's experience, the viewer learns that the vulnerability and fragility of memory. The viewer also learns about the fight and struggle to hold on to memories that are the very core of a person. On a national level, experiences of survivors of the Magdalene Laundries have not been prioritised. Instead, the Irish government encourages a collective forgetting rather than an active remembering. Cellar Door problematizes the notion of reality as an objective experience. It highlights this by considering the reality of someone suffering with Alzheimer's. In its focus on the specific subjective experience of reality, the film disproves the notion of one objective reality for all, which mainstream Hollywood cinema sustains, and reveals it to be a generic construct. Jeff King talks about the foregrounding of form as a key element of art cinema that is essential in this film. He notes that to foreground form and to reveal its status as an arbitrary construct is to challenge the ideological dimension of classical film. To disrupt the flow of images associated with classical style is also to disrupt the impression it creates that not just representation, but the reality it signifies. It is unproblematically given and self-sufficient. It is therefore to challenge the whole basis of a Hollywood approach rooted in a particular ideology, one that denies the importance of social inequality as far as individual experience and happiness is concerned. Despite the fact that Adie's reality is not a true representation of her reality that is actually happening around her, this reality is very real to her. This film therefore disrupts the notion that reality is unproblematically given and self-sufficient. A multi-layered narrative such as the one presented in this film suggests a past that is contested, a history that has many versions, all competing for verification. Memory is a subjective experience, and dementia is an extreme, unreliable, and problematically distorted version of this. The Magdalene Laundry experience is a highly contested one, where survivors must constantly reiterate their institutional experiences to a government that largely wishes to ignore them and that privileges the account of the church. Adie's experience in Cellar Door demonstrates that Ireland's gendered institutional past is something that needs to be dealt with in the present. Mayhow Ding argues that films about dementia, through their particular relationship with language, become a way to bring the nation and the world together as the past and presence of multiple worlds coalesce. Adie's trauma is as real to her now as when it first happened 50 or 60 years before. This is also the case for Ireland's ageing Magdalene Laundry survivors who have not been fully recognised and respected by the state. Cellar Door visually encapsulates the long-standing effect of suppressed memories and the tenuous nature of holding on to memories and experiences over time. Ermela Murray Kruger Furhoff et al. State that as cultural representations place the two in parallel, narratives of dementia try to shed new light on the ways in which national and international atrocities are constructed, suppressed, or selectively recalled. Kruger Furhoff et al. Argue that the image of a neurobiological forgetting characterized by recall of early life at the expense of recent experience might suggest the inevitability of confronting a problematic or repudiated past. Due to her dementia, Adie is unable to live in her present circumstances and is therefore compelled to live in a confusing version of her past. She relives certain events over and over, but struggles to reach beyond them. Her son Daniel, now an older man coming to visit her at the home, cannot fit in with her confabulations and often triggers her to start her repetitive cycle again in the bathtub. Most cycles begin with Adie submerged in a bathtub, and in the third cycle, Adie still finds herself back in the bathroom with her dress and hair wet. It is as if she is born again into her confabulation. It is like a rebirth, a starting over. Rosalind Galt and Karl Schoonover propose that art cinema can be defined by its impurity. They admit that there is a lack of strict parameters around the definition. Cinematic parameters are constantly challenged and made permeable in this film. Scenes spill into one another more and more as the film goes on and as Adie's confabulations start to break down. Scenes often change and adapt as we are experiencing them, revealing that there is always information that is on the cusp of revealing itself. The audience is continuously reminded of the constructed nature of the film, of the feeling of instability that results from the breaking down of standard cinematic form. This feeling of instability is inherent in Adie's confabulations. One example is when Adie is strapped to a chair in group therapy. The camera pans down and we can see that her right hand is strapped to the handle of a chair. The camera pans up to Adie's face as she tries to pull free from her restraints. It then pans down to her left hand, which is strapped to a bed, showing that in the blink of an eye, she has moved from a chair to a bed. The instability of Adie's perspective is clear here. One type of confinement spills into another, suggesting repeated strappings down over the years. As well as showing the speed of time in Adie's subjective confabulation, this editing also conveys the constant and recurring nature of her confinement. Another example of one scene or memory spilling into another is through the change of floor underneath another character's feet as she urinates in her chair. Towards the end of the film, Adie gains momentary clarity. There is an over-the-shoulder shot of young Adie looking at her true reflection of older Adie for the first time. This is an incredible mix of Adie's confabulation and the accurate reality of the present time with her son, Daniel. The camera frames young Adie from her usual space of dark colours and shadows, looking at her true and older self in the brightly colored space of the mirror. It then zooms in on older Adie, cutting younger Adie out of the shot. The mirror recognition scene demonstrates a breakdown of borders within the film, those between the inner subjective mind and the outer objective reality. At this moment, the past and present coexist within the scene, and this demonstrates that the past informs the present and is always a major part of it. Cellar Door succeeds as a countervisual film because it challenges the state-sanctioned perspective that promotes the relegation of wrongful gendered institutionalization to the past and the depreciation of the Magdalene Laundry experience. It instead depicts time as circular and inescapable, and the inescapable repetition of events. We experience the subjective point of view of an institutional female survivor suffering with Alzheimer's. We are reminded through this extreme subjective perspective that the notion of reality is different for everyone, and this goes against the universality of experience that classic Hollywood cinema tends to promote. The film uses 80s subjective viewpoint and confabulations in order to emphasize the continuous presence of the past in the present. In doing so, it highlights the need to deal with our institutional past on a national level by demonstrating the effects of unhealed trauma. Unlike in standard mainstream film, the borders in this film are permeable. Editing allows content from one scene to spill into the next, and events are repeated in different contexts by different characters. This alerts the audience to the constructed nature of cinema and allows viewers to be actively engaged as they reflect on the film. That's it. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you.